Probably something worth mentioning here right off the bat is that I had never played Link's Awakening before prior to the remake released on Switch. This was my first experience with the game, and it's still my only experience with Link's Awakening. I've never bothered to go back and play the original, so this is my only perspective on what Link's Awakening is. And in a way, I'm quite grateful for that fact that I've never played the original Link's Awakening before, because this was the first major Zelda release after Breath of the Wild, and I love Breath of the Wild. I think it's an incredible game, but I also do love the more traditional style of Zelda game. And so, with Breath of the Wild being so different, in ways it didn't even feel like a Zelda game to me, so it didn't really scratch my Zelda itch very much. But then Link's Awakening comes, and to me, this is essentially a brand new Zelda game, and it was a very exciting and delightful experience, booting up the game for the first time. I mean, first of all, you get that amazing anime intro cutscene, which really makes me want a proper Zelda anime to be made. I think that would be really cool. But then after that fantastic intro, we get to the title screen, and we hear this. And I'll be honest with you, hearing a new remixed version of the main Zelda theme at the title screen of what is to me essentially a brand new traditional Zelda game experience, it got me really excited for this game. It gave me genuine chills and goosebumps because that Zelda theme, it really means something to me. It's not just great music, it's not just the theme of the Zelda series. To me, that music signifies that you are about to play something that is the best shit that video games have to offer. As I said in my Zelda 1 video, the Zelda series is my favorite game series out there, and so getting a new Zelda game that I get to play is something very, very exciting to me. It's something very special, especially considering how rare it is. And even though to me Link's Awakening was a new experience, there was additional excitement that came from the fact that it is a remake of an existing Zelda game, because I had heard such great things about Link's Awakening and how there's a lot of people out there that really, really love this game, and so I knew going into it that I was going to be playing a really great Zelda game, so I was even more excited. And needless to say, the game did not disappoint, because almost no Zelda games disappoint, because the Zelda series is just too goddamn good for that. Link's Awakening is a great game. However, while I'm not going to say I was disappointed by the game in any way, it definitely did not live up to the hype that I had heard about this game from fans that were really particularly excited for the remake because they love the originals so much. As personally, I find this to be probably my least favorite Zelda game that I've played, minus Zelda 2, because I just don't like that game. I think that game belongs in the trash. But as far as Zelda games that I enjoy goes, Link's Awakening is actually the weakest of all of them as far as I've played. And like I said in my Link to the Past video, that's not because I think the game is bad in any way, it's just that compared to the incredible quality of every other Zelda game, I find this game to be a bit weaker than the other ones, because essentially, in reality, what Link's Awakening is it's really just A Link to the Past again, but now it's on the Game Boy. And that is a significant factor, because even though I played the Switch remake of it, it is a very faithful remake to the original. You know, it's like a one-for-one, tile-by-tile recreation, and you can definitely tell that playing the game because it retains many of the elements and limitations of what the original Link's Awakening had. The biggest example of this that's really prominent to me is in the level design of the game, because unlike A Link to the Past, you can tell that none of the areas in this game were designed for larger screen spaces like A Link to the Past that had scrolling screen capabilities. Every single screen in Link's Awakening is designed for that Game Boy resolution, and even though the Link's Awakening remake does have the ability to scroll, you can still tell that all of these areas are one-off, separated individual squares that you can now just smoothly travel from one to the other, but they are not one contiguous area. They are a bunch of smaller pieces that have now been glued together. In that way, I find the Link's Awakening remake to be so interesting, because even though it's not a Game Boy game and it doesn't have those technical limitations, it's still designed in the same way and designed with those technical limitations, and it still feels like I'm playing a Game Boy game, which in a way is very, very cool, but at the same time, the Game Boy was a very limited system, and it had a lot less capabilities than A Link to the Past, which in many ways results in the game feeling like just a lesser equivalent to what A Link to the Past was, because when you look at the overall game design and gameplay and general feel and style of what Link's Awakening is, it's almost one-to-one exactly identical to A Link to the Past. Like, yeah, it's got a completely new map and dungeons, and there's new items and all that stuff, but in terms of the general design philosophy that the game was constructed with, this is, for all intents and purposes, the exact same game as A Link to the Past. You can definitely tell that the goal when making this game was to put A Link to the Past on the Game Boy. Not literally with like a port or a demake, but in terms of what A Link to the Past is, we want to give that experience to Game Boy owners. So we make a game that is essentially identical to what A Link to the Past is, it's just a separate experience. Which in a way is a very good thing for the game, because A Link to the Past is a great game, and so by sharing pretty much all of that game's DNA, it kind of de facto also makes this a great game. And if you like A Link to the Past, it's pretty much guaranteed you're going to like Link's Awakening. But at the same time, it also means that Link's Awakening really isn't anything special, it's just A Link to the Past again, but now more limited than the previous game. That's not necessarily a problem in any way. I don't think that developers were wrong for trying to make essentially a pared-down Link to the Past experience on the Game Boy. It's just what the game is. And so naturally, I personally find the game to just be a lesser A Link to the Past. But fortunately for Link's Awakening, a lesser A Link to the Past is still a great game, so it's really not a problem in any way. As I've said, while I find the game to be weaker than other Zelda games that I've enjoyed, it's still a fantastic game, and I still really like it a lot. It's just that other Zelda games are just too damn good to compete with. That, and I do think there are certain elements here and there about Link's Awakening that are problematic on their own. One easy example of this is that I think the final boss of the game is some serious trash. I think it's a terrible, terrible, terrible boss fight, because the rules of the boss fight are completely arbitrary and do a terrible job of communicating to the player what you're supposed to do. Pretty much every single phase of the fight has some arbitrary criteria that you have to figure out that will enable you to hit the boss, and the game does nothing to help you figure out what you're supposed to do. Like, the very first phase of the fight, it's this, like, evil orb thing, and you try to hit it with the sword, that doesn't work, you try to hit it with arrows, bombs, whatever, nothing works. You can't hit this thing in any way, and you try everything and just nothing happens, and then eventually, after just a bunch of trial and error of nothing working, you throw some magic powder on it, and for some reason, arbitrarily, that damages the boss. But then this phase ends, and that no longer works, and now we have a different arbitrary rule of how you're allowed to hit the boss. And this happens repeatedly throughout this fight. Like, when it gets to the Ganon phase, you can only hit the boss with the spin attack or running with the Pegasus boots, and literally nothing conveys this to you. And that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because what is fundamentally different about a spin attack to a regular sword swing other than the amount of damage it does? Why would the player think that the spin attack is the only way to damage the boss at this time? And once again, with it being completely arbitrary and having no communication of what you're supposed to do, you just end up trying all these different things of like, do I have to dodge the attack and then hit it? Maybe shoot arrows at it, bombs, something? I don't fucking know. And it's just garbage. It's just so bad. And there's a couple of things like that throughout the game. Like, this one boss fight here has it as well, where you have to dodge its attack and then shoot an arrow at it. But if you do it too quickly, then the boss won't take damage. You have to intentionally pause and delay before shooting the arrow for it to actually register as a valid hit for some reason. Certain things about Link's Awakening like that are just so unintuitive and arbitrary and, quite frankly, poorly designed that I find that very unforgivable and very irregular for a Zelda game to have issues like this. Most Zelda games do not have these kinds of problems, but Link's Awakening does. Also, that one dungeon where you have to throw the ball around to, like, destroy the pillars, that one can kind of be a pain in the ass depending on how it ends up going for you, so that's kind of annoying. There's also certain aspects of the progression of the game in the overworld that can sometimes be a bit problematic and really hard to figure out on your own. For example, you might get stuck at a point where you just don't know where to go next, and you check the map repeatedly and you explore around and you're just like, I don't know where I can go next. The last item that I've got, I've explored all the areas that opened up that I've previously seen before, and it didn't take me anywhere new. I've exhausted every option of where I can go, and I don't know what to do. And then eventually you figure out that the reason that you're stuck is because you didn't cut one arbitrary blade of grass, where it turns out that the hidden path forward was buried underneath it. And it's like, how the fuck am I supposed to know that that one random piece of grass that is completely inconspicuous is where the way forward was? Honestly, that kind of thing is harkening back a little bit to the freedom that Zelda 1 gave you. Like, Link's Awakening is kind of somewhere in between Zelda 1 and A Link to the Past in terms of how guided it is, because you do have a map, and the game does do a fair amount of pointing you in the right direction of where to go next and what to do, but at the same time, it doesn't really tell you exactly where to go and where to do. It just points you in the right direction, but there's a lot of stuff that's still left open to you to figure out, which is nice, and it's cool, and it has that feeling of open explorative nature that Zelda 1 had, but it also introduces some of the same problems that Zelda 1 had. So, you know, there's a give and a take there. I don't ultimately think that this is a major problem for the game. It's just kind of a hiccup that you're gonna run into every now and then that's gonna result in you getting stuck, potentially. And so, Link's Awakening does have a couple of problems to it that I do find other Zelda games don't really have these issues generally. But aside from these issues, I think that the game overall is very, very solid and really fun and really enjoyable and pretty much has all of the same strengths that A Link to the Past had, which means it's a really great game. The overworld is very dense and compact, and there's a lot to do. The dungeons are generally well designed and fun. One big change that they made in this game from the dungeon design of A Link to the Past is that they have made the big key no longer necessary to get the key item in the game, which I think is very beneficial to the design of dungeons, as in A Link to the Past, the big key was basically your access point to the final stretch of the dungeon, as it gave you access to both the boss and the key item. So really the way it ended up working most of the time was that you would get the key item, which would then just take you on the direct path to the boss. Now the key item is something that can exist detached from the path to the main boss, so you can have more intricate and complex dungeon design, which is what the rest of the series went with, and I think that is definitely beneficial to general dungeon design. As far as the specifics of Link's Awakening's design, I don't really have much to say because, as I've already stated, the game is basically just A Link to the Past again. However, one difference that this game has in comparison to A Link to the Past is in the game's difficulty, as this is the beginning of Zelda games becoming ridiculously comically easy to the point where there's basically no challenge whatsoever. And I've not played the original Link's Awakening, so I'm not really aware. Let me know in the comments how this is. Was the original game also like that, or was it closer to A Link to the Past? Because A Link to the Past isn't like a super duper ultra hard game or anything, but it's a game where you absolutely have threat of dying sometimes and getting into trouble, which going forward in the Zelda series is really not something that ever happens. I didn't die a single time in my playthrough of Link's Awakening here or in my original playthrough when the remake first came out. And that applies to many, many, many future Zelda games where I've just never died in them because the difficulty is so insanely low that for anyone that has even a modicum of skill at games, it's really unrealistic that you're ever going to be challenged by anything that a Zelda game throws at you, which of course makes the games very accessible and very good for casual audiences, and they still manage to be enjoyable through other ways besides challenge. But when you look at Zelda 1 and A Link to the Past, they manage to have that while also having a modicum of challenge to them that can enhance the fun and make them even more enjoyable games. When I'm playing A Link to the Past, I have to pay attention and make sure that I'm fighting enemies effectively and I'm not getting careless and just lazily taking hits. but that is exactly what happens in basically every following Zelda game, where you really don't need to think about playing well whatsoever. And so this makes a lot of the aspects of the game's combat not really significant, and so you can kind of just brain dead plow your way through the game, and you're really not going to run into any difficulties along the way. This is one problem that I do have with the general Zelda series. I wish that it was willing to throw just a little bit more challenge at the player. Not something that would turn it into a hard game, but something that would force you to actually attempt to play the game well in any capacity. Because unfortunately, most of the games for the remainder of the Zelda series are not like that. And I'm sure a bunch of you are going to be suggesting, oh, well, why don't you play on hero mode? That kind of was designed exactly to fix this problem for more advanced players that want more of a challenge. There you go, there's your hard mode, but hero mode, in my opinion, is not really very adequate as a hard mode. There's a lot more that goes into making a proper hard mode than just increasing enemy damage and taking away healing, and in many ways, Zelda games are fundamentally not really designed in a way that is encouraging to dying repeatedly and having to play stuff over again. There's a lot to unpack there. It may honestly be worth its own video, so I'm not gonna get too much into it right now. But for now, I'll just say I have tried hero mode before, and I have found it to be a very unsatisfying hard mode that doesn't really function very well, and is in general less fun than playing a Zelda game in the normal mode, at least in my opinion. And again, it's entirely possible that this game is only so easy because of changes made to it for the remake that I'm not entirely aware of. I mean, I do know some of the things that the game changed from the original, but not everything, you know, in terms of like the core gameplay and how enemies behave and how the combat works. Those are things I don't really know. I do know that they added a bunch of extra heart pieces to the game, which gives you more health, so, you know, that's going to reduce how much damage you take. And the original game was not designed with the color dungeon in mind, which gives you either double damage or double defense, so that could also be compromising the game's difficulty in certain ways. So it's entirely possible that these issues only exist in the remake of Link's Awakening, and the original game might not have these problems, so it's probably I should probably one day give the original game a try. But at the same time, to be honest, the remake is really, really nice in very many ways. The quality of life improvements that have been made here are so fantastic. Like, the map is so incredibly good, the pin system here is just godlike. Frickin' every single game like this needs to have a pin system because it's so good. For a Metroidvania-type game where you're gonna get access to new areas as you acquire new abilities and stuff, having to remember every single thing you saw that you couldn't interact with yet, that is often just a recipe for you forgetting stuff and missing things, and it can lead to getting stuck and problems and all kinds of stuff. So being able to mark, like, okay, I need the hook shot for this, so I can remember that just by looking at the map, and I can look at that and see all the different pins that I've made that I have indicated are for the hook shot, and use them to quickly and easily revisit all those locations and access new areas. Like, it just makes the whole process so much easier and so much smoother and better. It is an invaluable addition to these kinds of games. Plus, of course, the technical improvements, like not having the game be a bunch of individual screens, that's very nice, and having more controls is also very helpful, because I do know that in the original game, the sword, shield, and Pegasus boots were all items that you had to equip, and you could only have 2 things at once, and because the sword is so fundamental, realistically, you only had 1 slot that you could actually use, unless you wanted to temporarily make yourself unable to attack enemies, which is just, like, ridiculous, and the amount of item menu switching that I imagine you have to do in the original game sounds like a pain in the ass. So having some of these things turned into fundamental elements of the game that you always have access to is a wonderful change, and honestly, I think they could have gone much further, because for some reason, they stopped at just having 2 equipable items on Y and X, which really, they could have done more with that, as the bumpers in the game do the exact same thing as the triggers, which is just a waste. That is 2 more inputs that you could have used for 2 more equipable items. Also, I personally think that they really should have turned the Rock's Feather into another fundamental ability that you always have access to, because I basically always want it equipped because you use it all the time in the game. I really don't know why they stopped at just letting you equip 2 items. They could have done much more in that. I mean, for fuck's sake, the D-pad doesn't even do anything in this game. You could have assigned 4 more items to D-pad directions if you wanted, and then that would have enabled you to have almost every single item in the game equipped at once, and you'd have to do almost no item management, and that would have been really nice. Hell, you could have even put another item slot on clicking the left stick. Why not? If a player finds that comfortable enough to do, then they could use that slot, and if a player doesn't want to do that, then they can just not use it. It really would just be a net benefit to the game, and they just didn't do it, which I find very strange. And really, that is not a problem whatsoever. That is some serious nitpick stuff of they could have just made the game even better, and they just chose not to for whatever reason. Doesn't really bring down the game very much. I would say my biggest issue with the Link's Awakening remake is the performance, as the frame rate is really inconsistent in this game. It dips a lot, particularly when you enter new areas initially. You will see the game chug and then eventually smooth out. But still, even then, the frame rate will dip quite regularly, and that is a really significant problem, especially for a game so simple as this. It's a wonder to imagine how this could be so taxing to even the Switch. Like, come on, man. Especially considering that this is Zelda we're talking about, I expect much better than this from Nintendo. I mean, Breath of the Wild had some performance issues, but that was also a colossal, super-duper ambitious game, so that's understandable, but this is a game that should run absolutely flawlessly, and it doesn't, and that's very puzzling and unfortunate. Doesn't harm the overall experience that much, but it is quite ugly, and I don't like it. Another aspect of the remake that I really don't like is the Dampé dungeon constructor thing. I think that this is a completely trash element of the game that really does not add much of benefit at all. And I find the design of this entire system to be fundamentally flawed, because this is no Zelda Maker. This is not something where you can create your own cool, unique Zelda dungeons and then send them off to other players to play and try other players' dungeons and try to make some really cool, fun dungeons that are really good. This is a system that the player creates for themselves out of a motivation to get rewards, because there are heart pieces and even a heart container, a bottle, and various things like that that you can unlock by playing these dungeons. And so your motivation for playing these is you want to get those things. And so you don't create these dungeons in such a way to create a fun experience for yourself necessarily. Your goal is to try to clear through these missions that Dampé gives you as quickly and efficiently as possible, which results in making dungeons that are incredibly simplistic, bare-bones, easy, and not very fun. And if you're really clever and smart with how you design them, it could result in you not really doing much of anything. Like, here's how the heart challenge of Dampé's dungeon mode goes. You need to make a dungeon where the rooms are in the shape of a heart. But if you get really clever with your room placements and layout and how things work, then you can create the dungeon in such a way that 95% of the rooms are completely optional and serve no function, and all you have to do is walk into the dungeon, go one room over and get the boss key, and then walk back to the initial room where the boss fight is waiting for you, and the entire dungeon you can just ignore. And I'll admit, the process of making dungeons like this that allow you to cheat the system to such a degree is kind of fun and kind of cool. Like, how little can I play this dungeon and still complete this challenge? That's kind of enjoyable in its own way, but the actual process of playing through these dungeons is so mundane and boring that it's really not something worth doing. And this is the best way to complete these challenges to get the rewards, which is your entire motivation for even doing this in the first place. This is why I think this mode is fundamentally flawed. Of course, you could just make a more legitimate dungeon for yourself that you have to actually play just for the sake of it, but also because these dungeons are just constructed from rooms from dungeons you've already played for the most part, it's still not really a very enjoyable experience overall, so I don't really find that to be an appealing option. So, in summary, this entire mode is kind of just garbage, and I just don't really play it very much. Normally, when I play a Zelda game, I like to get all the heart containers, but in cases like this, I will pass on a heart container or two when the game has really fucking stupid, annoying stuff like this. That's really just a waste of the player's time. Minish Cap also has shit like this. Anyone who knows about all the fucking gotcha shit in that game knows what I'm talking about. We'll get there when we get there. Another aspect of Link's Awakening that I'm not a really big fan of that is partially a product of the remake, but was also somewhat of an issue in the original game, is this is when the Zelda series started to implement mini-games. I mean, there were some mini-games in A Link to the Past, but those mini-games were things that were baked into the core gameplay, which I find much more tolerable and fun in most cases. It's taking the core Zelda gameplay and remixing it into some kind of unique challenge, and I think that's perfectly fine for the most part. What I'm talking about when I say minigames in the negative sense is when we completely stop playing The Legend of Zelda and play a different video game inside The Legend of Zelda. In Link's Awakening's case, I'm talking about the crane machine and the fishing added in the remake. Now, these are not significantly damaging parts of the game. They're not, like, miserable or anything, but they're not exactly fun, in my opinion. They're kind of just things that you have to do if you want to get everything. And I find stuff like this in any game, really, to be very frustrating because I'm playing The Legend of Zelda because I enjoy the gameplay of The Legend of Zelda, and I want to be playing The Legend of Zelda. I don't want to be playing some underwhelming fishing or crane minigame. And in the remake, there are quite a number of things that you have to get in both of these minigames. You have to play them a fairly significant amount, which means playing a lot of not Zelda in this Zelda game. And every time I get to these parts, all I can think of is that when it's over, I'm like, thank God, and now I can go back to playing Link's Awakening, the game I actually wanted to play in the first place when I loaded this game up. Now, of course, this kind of thing can definitely be seen as an overreaction. It's really not that harmful to the game, and I can definitely be making a mountain out of a molehill here for sure. But in my personal opinion, no matter how small the negative impact of something like this is onto a game, the end result is still that it hurts the game more than it helps it by adding something to the game that is less fun than if it was just not here, and instead I was playing the more fun Legend of Zelda game the entire time, rather than having certain periods where I have to stop playing Zelda and start playing something that I really don't want to do. Of course, in many ways, these things are optional, and you could say, well, just don't do it then, but to that I would say, wouldn't the game just be better if it didn't have parts I didn't want to play, and only had parts that I did want to play? That would make the game, overall, as a package, better on a percentage level than it is by having these things that slightly bring it down. And this sort of thing is what sows the seeds for these kinds of problems becoming more prominent in future games, because it starts with a harmless crane minigame here, and then it turns into bombchu bowling and fishing in Ocarina of Time, which are actually miserable, and I fucking hate doing them. Now, of course, this is not a problem specifically with Link's Awakening or the Zelda series. This is more so an issue that I personally have with minigames in general baked inside of larger games. I generally find that to be a very questionable thing that video games do that I don't personally believe makes them better, and so it's a problem I have with a lot of games. And again, it's not a major problem, but it is a problem that I think is widespread in the video game sphere that I would like to see more games address this issue. And it's why I like games that are very focused and do not deviate from their core gameplay. They are one thing, they know what that one thing is, and they just try to be that thing, without shoehorning in other things outside of the core experience that really don't add to it in a significant way. I personally find that results in better games. Anyway, that was quite a tangent there. Back to Link's Awakening in particular, one last aspect of the remake that I guess is worth talking about is the art style, as that was a little bit of a controversy when this game first came out. A lot of people really didn't like the art style of this remake. Personally, I really don't have a problem with it. I think it's fine. I think it looks good. I really don't see what the issue is here. To be honest, I really don't pay much attention to stupid internet discourse stuff about things like this, so I don't even really know what the argument was. But what I have gleaned from the bits of information here and there that I have heard is that it generally seems like people have an issue with the fact that Link's Awakening, the remake, tries to faithfully recreate the sprite-based look of the original game, rather than trying to recreate what the game was kind of intending to be in the way it was envisioned, as like the artwork is far more detailed and much more elaborate than the actual game sprites were, due to the game only looking the way it did because of technical limitations. And so people would have preferred something that looked more like what they wanted the game to look like, rather than how it ended up looking like originally. I think that's generally what the core of the issue was. Maybe. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments or something. So to my understanding, the issues are the fact that like Link is like a little button-eyed chibi version of himself, instead of being more like the classic Link that we see in the artwork, where he's more of kind of an anime-style young man adventurer type with more realistic proportions and stuff. Instead of this tiny little chibi, almost toy-like or diorama-like style that they went with for the remake, I guess people would have preferred something that was maybe more painterly and dreamlike and kind of captured the sort of feel of like the anime intro of the game, which I can totally understand wanting something like that. And I think that probably would have looked very cool, but personally, I find that what they went for is perfectly adequate and looks really good and is charming in its own way. It's unique for the Zelda series, and I think it does fit the general feel and vibe of Link's Awakening, in that I do think it's very dreamlike, that everything is all small and disproportionate, and everything kind of looks like a toy, but not really. It's very strange that things are like plasticky, but also kind of real looking in certain ways, and everything looks kind of unnatural. To me, that does a fairly good job of making things feel like a dream, and it creates a separation between the reality that we see in the intro of the game, where we see what Link really looks like and what his world is actually like, and what he's dreaming of, that this looks very, very different. I think that separation effectively communicates the fact that we are in a dream here. And from a practical perspective, I think this is probably a good art style to go with, because since this is a tile-by-tile remake of the original game, there are certain aspects of the game that really would not work very well if you tried to go with a more grounded style, because, like, the houses in this game are bigger on the inside than they are on the outside. On the outside, the houses are really, really, really tiny, and then you walk in them and they're more livable. So how would you justify that in a more proportionally correct universe? Like, why are all the houses so goddamn small? I guess you could say that maybe the game should not have been a tile-by-tile remake. Maybe they should have gone for something more like a reimagining of the original Link's Awakening, but that's an entirely different game at that point, and that's not the game they wanted to make with this remake. They wanted to make a faithful one-to-one recreation of the original, and you can't really say they're wrong for doing that. That is what they wanted to do with this remake. There's no right or wrong way to remake a game. If you want to make something that is almost identical to the original game, that can be a very good remake. Or if you want to go the Samus Returns route and make basically a completely different video game that's just inspired by the original, that can also work as a remake. One type of remake is not objectively better than another one, they're just different, and so they chose to go with a tile-by-tile, exact, accurate remake for Link's Awakening. Okay, I think that's perfectly fine. Maybe you disagree with the decision, but that's what they decided to do. And when you make that kind of decision, I think this sort of art style makes more sense for something like that, rather than something that is more representative of what Link's Awakening was originally supposed to look like. Plus, there are also some aspects of the game that I think would just be really, really bizarre looking if you tried to go with a more grounded art style, like the fucking talking alligator man in the straw hat. What the fuck is that gonna look like if you try to go for a more grounded art style? That would just be incredibly fucking weird. Not to mention that there's a bunch of like Goombas and chain chomps in this game that definitely lend themselves to a more cartoony art style. So that's my general 2 cents on the whole art style controversy that this game went through, I guess. I personally really don't think it's a problem. I think the game looks good. I think the art style that they went with is a smart, sensical choice for the game that they decided to make, and I really don't have a problem with it. But I'm not going to say anyone's wrong for having a problem with it. I can definitely understand why people would have an issue with this game's art style. It's just not personally something that bothers me. And that is my general thoughts of Link's Awakening. As I said, probably my least favorite Zelda game of the games I like and of the games I've played. I'm sure there will probably be other ones that I like less that I have yet to play. There are numerous Zelda games that I've yet to get to. That's part of the reason I want to do this marathon through the Zelda series, because I want to play all the stuff I've been missing out on for so long. But despite its problems, and despite the fact that I think it's not as good as other Zelda games, I still think the game is really, really good, and I like it a lot. Now, of course, I'm sure there are many of you that are going to be going, but what about the story? What about the weirdness of the game and the dreamlike qualities of it? Pariah, you didn't talk about any of that at all. Well, that's because I think Link's Awakening does have enough here that perhaps I could do a dedicated story video on this game. So until then, thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.